Okay, today is a big day for Project CB9. Now, I've got a local mobile mechanic coming to help me out here. The H22 in this engine is leaking a little oil, and I believe it's coming from the cam seals. Now, even though the cam seals were replaced while the engine was on the motor stand, what you have to do is lift up the retainer of the cams and then put the seals in place. So he's gonna come help me out. He's giving me a helping hand. He cut me a good deal. He's only charging me like a quarter of the price since I'm helping him out. So let me go ahead and show you guys what's going on in the engine bay.
Okay, right there where my flashlight's shining, as you can see, there's a little bit of oil remnants, and that's basically where the block meets the head. So what I believe is happening is you got the two cam gears, and obviously you got the cam seals behind here, and what's happening is the oil is leaking down from the front side, and then actually finding its way back onto that ledge right there. So that's what's going on. I got an oil leak, so every time I drive this thing, let me go ahead and show you what my driveway looks like. So I don't know if you can see these oil spots, but this is every time I drive this car. I've only been driving this thing for like maybe 10-20 minutes at a time. So the oil leak is not something to ignore. It's not like one or two drips, but this is a constant dripping, and it's basically annoying. I'm gonna go ahead and resolve this, make sure that the engine is sealed up tight.
Now, before the mobile mechanic arrives, I'm gonna go ahead and raise up the car, put it up on jack stands, take off the front driver's side wheel. I'm gonna go ahead and take off all the belts and the pulleys. I'm gonna see what I can get disassembled before he gets here, because I'm gonna help him out as best I can. Help save some time here.
Okay, you got the car jacked up, put on jack stands on the front side, and got the rear tires blocked off. So here's what's going on in the engine bay. As you can see, I got oil remnants dripping onto the axle. Also, on that plastic cover right there for the timing, a little bit of oil remnants right there, along with the engine block as well. So hopefully you're gonna resolve this issue with this oil leak with the cam seals. Okay, so basically what we have to get access to is the timing components right here. And before we remove this valve cover, I need to go ahead and loosen up the electrical that's going over to the alternator. So I'll disconnect the two connections of the alternator and basically pull this backwards. That way we can lift this up. So I'll go ahead, undo the screws on the spark plug cover, take these 4 bolts out, take the coil packs out, remove those things. And I'm gonna go ahead and remove both belts, one from the power steering pump and one from the alternator. And before doing so, I'm gonna go ahead and remove this cruise control servo. It's kind of in the way. So I'll take a deep socket with a 10mm, take those 2 10mm bolts out, and basically lift this thing carefully out of the way. That way I can get access to tensioners and whatnot. So once the belts are off, go on the bottom side of the motor. And as you can see here with the H22, I can't get access to that crank bolt. So what I have to do, go back to the top side of the motor and basically loosen that nut and that bolt for that motor mount. But before doing so, I'm gonna take my floor jack, put a piece of 2x4 on the saddle, and basically support the motor on the driver's side. That way I can increase it or decrease it depending on the height. So basically I need to drop down the motor a little bit so I can get access to this main crank bolt right here. It's just one of the characteristics of an H22 swapped CB7, CB9. So let's go ahead and start taking some things apart. Alrighty, a few days later, after the mobile mechanic stopped by, gave me a hand for about 3 hours. So what we did, obviously removed all the timing components, and the main culprit right here was these cam seals. Let me go ahead and zoom in, show you what's going on. So when I had this H22 on the engine stand, I was replacing all the seals. Basically what I did is I put these cam seals, and it was basically flush against this head right here. As you can see here, there's a bevel, so I was off by about 1/8 of an inch. So it was my mistake. I should have drove this thing in with a socket or whatever. But what we did as a precautionary measure is remove these cam retainers with all these bolts, lift it up, and we're able to slide the seals in much easier, and then put this thing back down and torqued everything to spec. And that was for both cam seals right there. Let me go ahead and show you guys the part number. So if you guys are replacing cam seals on H22, this is the part number you need. You obviously need 2 of these things since it's dual overhead cam. And so what this engine was doing, it was actually leaking oil on the bottom side where these cam seals are at. And it was just flowing down the head right there. And there's a ledge, which is basically the block. So where the block met the heads right there, oil is just accumulating right on top of there and just dripping down. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean this thing up as best I can down there. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and put the plastic cover into place. And then we'll go ahead and put the cams in, torque those to spec, and make sure there's a top dead center as well. So let's go ahead and start doing some reassembly on this engine. Now, as far as the timing belt's concerned, a little bit of oil got in the timing belt, and the mechanic recommended I will go ahead and change the timing belt. I think this thing was about $25, so just as a precautionary measure, went ahead and ordered a replacement Gates timing belt. Now, Gates is an OEM manufacturer for Honda, just FYI, so you can go ahead and get a Honda OEM or a Gates one. They're very, very close. And there's the part number, T226, if you have an H22 timing belt. But I've got a new timing belt on order, but let's go ahead and start the reassembly until that timing belt arrives, and then we can proceed with the next steps. Okay, torque specifications, 16 foot-pounds for the 2 12mm bolts on that mount, 33 foot-pounds for that 14mm on the mount that goes up to the head, and 37 foot-pounds for both 14mm cam bolts. Now, the best method, in my opinion, to torque these cam bolts is go ahead and get a ratchet extension, stick it through one of the sprockets here on the cam, and you want to rest the extension right there on the top of the head right there. And then you can go ahead and take your torque wrench and torque this front one. Now, the back side is a little bit more trickier since we have less working space, but I was still able to manage to get my extension through that cam right there, rest on the head. And in order to torque this thing with a torque wrench, so what I did is went ahead and got a crow's foot and put on my torque wrench, and that's how I torqued it. And since I don't have the clearance to put a traditional socket on the torque wrench, I went ahead and put a 14mm crow's foot on my torque wrench, and I was able to grab a hold of the bolt sideways right here and basically pull up on my torque wrench. Worked out perfect. So 37 foot-pounds for both cam bolts. Okay, we can go ahead and wait for the new timing belt to arrive. We can get that installed and put everything back together. All right, a few days later, back to work on Project CB9. Today's goal is to go ahead and install the new timing belt into position. So I got the cam gears reinstalled, and the bolts are torqued to specification with a little bit of thread lock on them. Let me go ahead and show you guys the tensioner down below. This is a little tricky part right here. All right, this part right here is a mechanical timing belt tensioner installed while the motor's on the stand. As you can see, it's held into place with the factory nuts, one right there and one right there. And then how this thing works, is there's a shaft right here with a rounded bolt. And basically what you do is you unscrew it or tighten it, whatever you want to do, and it basically pushes up against this arm. And that arm basically puts tension on the timing belt. So this is basically a fail-safe method so your timing belt doesn't go too loose. But anyhow, work on the inside of the engine bay. This is very tough. I might need some stubby wrenches, but I'm hoping I can go ahead and get this timing belt slipped into position. So what my plan is to line up these cam gears at top dead center, but I gotta line these lines right here perfectly with one another. And then once I have the timing belt routed on the top of the cam gears, then it basically feeds an engine bay. It basically contacts the water pump right there. And then right down there is the roller for the tensioner. And the back side of the belt will then be on that roller tensioner right there. And then right here on the bottom side of the motor, I'm gonna try my best in order to slide this belt onto this lower pulley. I don't know if it's possible. We'll see what happens, but I really don't want to undo that mechanical tensioner. It is very tough to work in the engine bay with that frame rail right in the way. So let's go ahead and route that timing belt and see what happens. All right, a few hours later, finally got the timing belt back in position. The camshafts are top dead center. The camshaft on the bottom is also top dead center. Now there was an issue getting this timing belt on. When I did a few rotations, this thing was off by about a tooth. Now there's one trick of the trade that I learned on YouTube, which actually seemed to work. So instead of pulling the timing belt back off, what this one guy did, let me go ahead and show you. So you'll get this little screwdriver bit, and what you'll do is you actually put it in between the belt and the camshaft, and you have someone on the bottom turn the crankshaft, and this will go between the timing belt and the cam sprocket. And basically what that'll do is that'll reset one of the teeth, either forward or backward, depending on what direction you need to go. So it seemed to work out great. Didn't have to pull the belt off, but a little trick of the trade right there. Just a small screwdriver bit jammed up in between the belt and the cam sprocket. Now, the cam sprocket's not damaged by any means, just an FYI. So I was glad I learned that trick of the trade watching YouTube a few weeks ago. Now the toughest thing by far of doing this timing belt job is this manual tensioner right here. So basically you got a free nut on the bottom and you got this shaft with a rounded nut on the top. So what I had to do is actually remove the tensioner from the engine, put this on the bench vise, and then actually turn this tensioner down all the way because I could not get this timing belt on whatsoever. And then my neighbor had to come over, give me a helping hand. You have to actually hold the top part of the nut with a crow's foot, and then you have to go on the bottom and use a stubby 14mm wrench and actually push this nut down towards the bottom of the base in order to lock this manual tensioner in position. Now a factory tensioner is a hydraulic. Basically what you'll do is you'll just bolt it on in position, and it has a pin there, and then once everything's top dead center, you pull the pin out and it actually automatically does tension. But this is a manual tensioner. It's fail safe, but it's a pain in the butt to work with, but hopefully it'll pay its dividends in the future. So let me show you guys top dead center on the camshafts. So you got this up arrow right here, and you got another up arrow. Obviously you need to face upwards, but the most important thing is you got notches here on the camshafts. And these two notches need to face each other, and that's basically parallel with the deck or the head. So we're good to go on that aspect. Let me show you the crankshaft. So up here on the crankshaft, you got two arrows. So you got this top arrow right here on the sprocket tooth, and that arrow needs to point right there on the bottom of the engine block. So once those are aligned, you know that the bottom crankshaft is top dead center. So once you have the time belt position, go ahead, turn the engine counterclockwise a few times, and just make sure that everything's top dead center on the bottom and the top. And once you do about 2 or 3 rotations, and top dead center is correct on top and bottom, checking repeatedly, then you're good to go putting everything back together. So let's go ahead and reassemble some things. There's a lot of parts here, but I think the hardest part's over with. Now it's just basically finagling these plastic covers between the frame rails and the engine itself. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, day number 3, taking care of project CB9 with KMC replacement and also a new timing belt. So now we're on the reassembly stages. Got the top cover installed. We got the 2 10mm bolts. Now this 10mm bolt right here is a little tricky to get out because it's real deep. Now I couldn't get this bolt out, so that's when I had the mobile mechanic stop by and he helped me disassemble things and whatnot and get the cam seals put in place. And now I'm just reassembling things. But anyways, this is a long 10mm bolt. I basically had to put a floor jack under the engine with a wood block, raise up the engine as high as I could on this side. I was able to get that bolt out, and then in order to get the new bolt in, I had to ream out the hole over here on this plastic cover so I can basically angle that bolt in. But that's just a little tricky part of working on the CB7 with an H22 motor in place. And then I got the bottom cover installed, which was really tough. So let me go ahead and show you guys what I can on top of the engine of what was causing this thing to hang up. Now I'm not sure if you can see down there, but there's 2 hard power steering lines that are hugging the strut tower, and basically that was causing a hang up on getting that lower cover in place, which is a hassle. But my neighbor came over, he was able to basically push that cover this way while I went on the bottom side and pushed this thing upwards. We finally got it. I think we were fighting with that thing for about 30 minutes or something like that. Pain in the butt putting that thing back in. But there's quite a few 10mm bolts holding that bottom cover in position. I believe there's 4 or 5 10mm bolts. So I think there's like 3 on the left side and I believe 2 on the right side. And one of the most important components is the lower main crank. Now my neighbor came over and gave me a helping hand. Basically you have to put this little hexagonal tool in here, hook that to a breaker bar, and then one person has to hold that breaker bar and another person has to take a large torque wrench, 181 foot-pounds, and torque that 19mm nut right there until it clicks. I mean, fighting with that thing for a little bit, pushing down, and finally that torque wrench just clicked. And man, what a sight that was. So anyhow, lower crank is torqued to factory specification, 181 foot-pounds, so we're good to go. So now that we're on the reassembly, we're gonna go ahead and install the alternator belt, which goes on the innermost pulley. And then this outermost pulley right here is for the power steering pump. So down here in the engine bay, that alternator pulley actually goes around the AC compressor as well and loops around the alternator and goes back down to the main crank. So let's go ahead and thread that in position. I'll go ahead and tighten up the alternator. There is, I believe, a 12mm bolt on the bottom side. It's a little tricky to see with the camera, but in order to adjust tension on the alternator, this is a 10mm bolt that you tighten up right here, and it basically pulls the alternator outwards away from the engine and puts tension on that belt. So once you have proper tension on the belt, using that 10mm bolt, then go on the bottom side, tighten up that 12mm along with another 12mm bolt behind this power steering pump. And the power steering pump is relatively easy. Just right on top of this pulley right here, go back down to the engine bay, and then loop it around the outside pulley right here. And once that belt is looped, go ahead and tighten this bolt up. And once you have proper tension on the belt, go ahead and tighten up this 12mm bolt right here. So let's go ahead, reinstall the belts, and we'll go from there. Okay, we have proper tension on the power steering belt and the alternator belt. Now the alternator bolt on the very top there, that's 14mm by the way. And the bottom I believe is a 12. And there's one bolt right down here for the power steering pump, that's 12mm. So once you have both belts tensioned, then you can adjust those mounting bolts. So I was gonna go ahead and reconnect the power steering line, but however that's gonna be in the way of the valve cover. The valve cover is gonna be the last step. So we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the cruise control servo into position, which is right here. This was removed so we can get major access over here to the timing components and also the belts for the alternator and the power steering. So there's two 10mm bolts that mount that servo, and you're gonna need probably a 12-inch extension for your ratchet in order to reach this thing. So one bolt right there and one bolt right here. Now this back bolt right here, closest to the mount, that can be loose right there because there's a notch on the mount for the servo, just a little FYI. And then once you have it in position, you can tighten it down. So once the servo installed, go ahead and reconnect the electrical and also the vacuum line as well right there. And we cannot connect the electrical for the alternator just yet because you have to put the valve cover in place because the electrical actually branches across that valve cover right there. So the power steering line and the alternator connections will go last. Okay, let's install that servo. Okay, back to work on project CB9. Today, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the valve cover. Let me show you what's going on with that. And here's the torque sequence on the valve cover. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, and number 8. And I've got the valve cover upside down right here. I reinstalled the OEM valve cover gasket. This is a much higher quality gasket than the aftermarkets. So I was able to clean off as much as I could with the Honda Bond right there on the cam cap seals and on the corners. Same thing on this side as well. Now you have the choice if you want to put the Honda Bond directly on the head right here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put the Honda Bond on the gasket itself upside down on the valve cover. And then when I reinstall it, I'll be able to just put this right on top of it. Because sometimes spreading out the Honda Bond on this metal can be tricky. I think I'll have more precise control on the valve cover gasket itself. So you want to put some right here, right there, some more right there in the cam corner, and same thing on the time belt side, right here, right there, right here, and right here. And as you can see with the limitations itself, with the time belt in place, reaching down there with the Honda Bond tube, you got limitations. So that's why I'm going to try the valve cover gasket. Okay, so let's go ahead, put some Honda Bond on this valve cover gasket in certain spots. Okay, so I'm going to show you the spots I'm going to apply the Honda Bond to. Right here on this corner. Right here on this corner of the cam cap. Same thing right here. Right here. Right there. This corner. And same thing on this side. This radius. This corner. This corner. This corner. This corner. And this radius. So let's go ahead, apply some Honda Bond, and we'll go ahead and position onto the engine. And before we go ahead and put the valve cover on our H22, we need to make sure that this fuel injector wiring harness is loose. There was two 10mm bolts I had to remove, one right there and one right there. So basically I have to pull this thing away while I put the valve cover in. And obviously the alternator cable is disconnected because this thing drapes across the valve cover right there. And then the power steering line's out of the way too. Okay, let's go ahead and install this thing. Okay guys, it's been a few hours since we put the valve cover back into place. The Honda bond should be fully cured now. I went ahead, reconnected the battery. So let's go ahead, take the key, turn the ignition, and see if our efforts have paid off. Go ahead and say a prayer. Whoa! And that's what I'm talking about, guys. Cam seal replacement and timing belt swap out, it now works. And you can do the same thing also. Alright, so since the battery's disconnected, the ECU has to relearn the fuel curve. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this engine idle for a few minutes. But guys, I am just more than ecstatic that this thing just starts right up. Alrighty guys, that wraps up the cam seal and time belt replacement for Project CB9 with the H22. Fingers crossed, there's no more oil leaks on the back of the block, but I'll keep checking every time I drive the car. Now if the problem persists, then we may have a much bigger issue, such as damaged camshafts or worse, a bad head gasket. Now if you have any specific questions on replacing cam seals or a time belt for an H22, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful or entertaining, please give me a thumbs up. Thanks for watching and have a fantastic day.